It's a really, really iconic film. 1942, Casablanca, 1942, and it's set in 1941 in Casablanca, funnily enough, which is in Morocco. Now, Rick Blaine, the character Rick Blaine, who's played by Humphrey Bogart, is an American living in Casablanca who runs a cafe nightclub. And around about this time, German military officers and also Vichy French and also refugees on their way through to the US are to be found, all mixed up. And at the very beginning of the film, an insignificant thief, Ugart, has come by some letters of transit, as he calls them, from two German couriers who, it turns out, were murdered. And these letters of transit enable free travel within occupied Europe to Portugal, which was neutral. And refugees would pay a really high price. This is why Ugart wanted them. Refugees would pay a high price for such letters, and Ugart persuades Rick to hold on to the letters just for a few hours, which he agrees to, unwillingly at first, and then Ugart is soon arrested. Now, that's the last you see of him in the film, but that is a very pivotal part of the film. Also, Captain Louis Renault is a police official, not exactly honest or above board, in fact, quite openly corrupt, but quite a laugh as well. Ilse Lund, who's played by Ingrid Bergman, turns up at Rick's nightclub. Ilse being a former lover of Rick in Paris back in 1940. Now, this film was set in 1941. The film was released in 1942. So there's a past life between Rick, Humphrey Bogart, and Ilse, Ingrid Bergman. Now, she thought her husband, Victor Laszlo, was dead, which is how they ended up in a relationship. Ilse recognises Rick's friend Sam when she comes into the nightclub, who plays piano at the nightclub, and asks him to play her favourite song as time goes by. Now, this song is very iconic throughout the film. It's one of the most memorable parts of the film, even to this day. She, with her husband Victor Laszlo, who it turned out had not actually died, but was sick and hiding back in 1940 from punishment by, Victor is a fugitive and a Czech resistance leader. Ilse and Victor are seeking passage to America to help the resistance. And to do this, they require letters of transit, which is why they've come to Casablanca. Now, Major Heinrich Strasser, who's a Nazi, however, has made it his business to come to Casablanca to thwart Laszlo. Casablanca was originally a play. It was originally a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. It was actually sort of an unpublished play. And the film was shot entirely at Warner Brothers Studios, except for one airport sequence, but also shot in America. When it was in production, it was a major film, but it wasn't a film that anyone would have expected to be significant decades later. Initially, it was just a reasonably successful film, but then so were hundreds of other films that year. Over time, it has become an iconic film, and the actors, the song, and specifically some very quotable lines from the script have all survived and lived much longer than anyone could have expected, and are now kind of part of today's lexicon as well. Dooley Wilson, who played Sam, the pianist, was only one of 3 American actors in the film. Most of the other main actors were from other countries. It was a very cosmopolitan film, although made in America. Ingrid Bergman, for example, is Swedish. Dooley Wilson wasn't a pianist, by the way. He was a drummer and had to fake playing the piano. Conrad Veidt, who played Major Heinrich Strasser, in reality, the actor was a German refugee. He had fled the Nazis in the war and with his Jewish wife. However, because of his accent as an actor, he would play Nazis in many American films. Bogart's line, "Here's looking at you, kid," which is said 4 times in the film, was not in the draft screenplays, but it's basically a comment that he made to Ingrid Bergman as he taught her poker between takes. And also it was Bogart's idea to make Rick a chess player, because Bogart was quite an accomplished tournament player himself. The film was unusually shot in sequence, because only the first half of the screenplay was ready when shooting began. The end scene with the plane in the background, this scene here that you see, but you don't see all the plane, but you see the lights in the background. The end scene with the plane in the background, the plane is actually a cardboard plane, much smaller than a real plane, and they used lots of fog to disguise this. Ingrid Bergman was 5 centimetres taller than Humphrey Bogart, who had to stand on blocks or sit on cushions in scenes with her. And the original play was written on a trip to Europe. Now, this is quite an interesting thing. The original play was written on a trip to Europe in 1938, the authors went to Austria and saw the Anschluss and the result of that, and then saw in the south of France, saw a nightclub with a multinational clientele of exiles and refugees. And occasionally you see the Cross of Lorraine, which is the symbol for Free French Forces. Sometimes overtly, you actually see it at the beginning, but often you see it as shadows cast. Interestingly, the Vichy regime of occupied France. Now, I'm getting slightly off the film, but something interesting. The original inspiration for the original play was the Vichy regime of occupied France and its effects, and the displacement of people having to go to Casablanca to get papers to go elsewhere. But the Vichy-occupied France was actually the birthplace of disco, believe it or not. A youth subculture in World War II France was the Zazou, and they were youths, and they wore big expressive clothing, influenced by the American zoot suit fashion of a few years before, and they carried umbrellas to convey Britishness, and they would like to speak to each other in English, even though they're French. And they danced in underground nightclubs to bebop and jazz, and basically to express dissidence and to generally piss off the Nazis as much as possible while remaining underground and not getting into too much trouble. Now, when forced underground, their clubs were one of the first music venues which embraced the record player, new technology, the record player, rather than live bands, and particularly the adoption later, a short while after the war, but as a result of the Zazou movement, a nightclub owner called Regine would take this movement and use 2 record players side by side to maintain uninterrupted music for dancing. So that's where your 2 turntables and a microphone comes from. Well, anyway, back to the film. 1942, Casablanca. Thank you very much. And